Hi, welcome to this tutorial. I'm happy you're here. So, as simple as it may seem, knowing when something is either on or off can be a great tool to designing something useful. So, answers to the following questions are what this lesson plans to tackle. Is a button being pressed? Has a switch been turned on? What is the status of my on-off sensor? So when you can answer questions like these, then you can implement actions based on that current status. So, for example, if a button is being pressed, do this. Otherwise, do that. Or, if my sensor is active, take this action. Otherwise, don't do anything. So I think you kind of get the gist there. But before we can implement the actions, we have to be able to track the status and the changes on the digital pins. So this tutorial is primarily going to cover the function digitalRead. We're going to talk a lot about digitalRead, but we're also going to begin looking at the serial library, talking about serial communications, which is your Arduino talking with your computer and vice versa. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this lesson. For this tutorial, you're going to need an Arduino board. I have the Arduino Uno here. You can use any Arduino or clone. I do highly recommend sticking with the Arduino name brand, that way we know we're on the same page. You're also going to need a 10K resistor. So the lines on a 10K resistor, you should have a brown one, a black one, an orange one, and then probably a gold one after that. You'll need a momentary push button, so that's a button that you press and then it pops back up. You're going to need about 4 jumper wires. That's what I used. You could probably use less. More wouldn't hurt either. And then you're going to need a solderless breadboard. So in order to set up the circuit, let's take a look at the schematic. So from the schematic, you should be able to set up the circuit on your board. And so what the colored lines represent, those are just jumper wires that we talked about before. So here I've got a jumper wire going from 5 volts to the breadboard. And it goes to that line on the breadboard where there's a red line that runs horizontally across the picture here. And that means that that entire line is electrically connected and it is going to be carrying the 5 volts. So it's like creating a 5-volt bar on your breadboard. And then you notice I do the same thing with the ground. So I take the ground from the Arduino board and I move it up to the breadboard. And so then that whole blue line is now ground. So that is the ground and the voltage, the 5 volts that I've set up on the breadboard, and now I can connect to that. So the first thing after that is I'm going to take a jumper wire and run it from pin 2 to one side of my push button, and here it's the right side. And then I'm going to take my 10K resistor and I'm going to hook it up to the ground bar on the solderless breadboard. Now on the other side of the push button, I run a wire to power to the 5-volt line. So let's just quickly talk about this circuit here. So if I'm not pressing the push button, what kind of voltage is pin 2 exposed to? Well, you can see pin 2, it's connected to the right side of that push button. And if it can't get to the left side of the push button, that means it's going through that 10K resistor and it's going to ground. Because you can see it's connected to that ground bar. So if I'm not pressing the button, the right side is connected to ground. So that means 0 volts is going to be seen, quote unquote, seen by pin 2. Now what happens when I press the push button? Well, when I press the push button, now the 5-volt power is now it's going to be exposed to pin 2. So now pin 2 is going to go high. It's going to go to it's going to register 5 volts because now it's being exposed to the 5 volts from the Arduino. So that's just kind of a rough idea of what's taking place here. So when you're not pressing that button, it's 0 volts, and when you are pressing the button, 5 volts is being seen by pin 2, and that's what it's registering. Okay, so that's pretty much the circuit setup. Let's go ahead and jump into the sketch. All right, go ahead and open up your Arduino IDE and go to File, Examples, Basics, digitalRead Serial. All right, let's go ahead from the top of the program and look through. So the first block of code we come to is a multi-line comment. So the multi-line comment here, it gives a short description of the program and the circuit. And then also note that it says that the example code is in the public domain. So that pretty much tells us that we can use and reuse and modify this program however we feel appropriate. And it is always a good habit to read the comments. So I recommend developing that habit as you continue to program and as you continue to mess with Arduino. All right, so let's move on to the next block of code. That's generally where we will declare and initialize variables, and this sketch is no different. So here we're making a variable, and oh, hey, it's our familiar friend integer. So it's int, and notice that the color's orange, and we know that's why, because that's a data type, and which means it's a keyword for Arduino, so it turns orange. And then we've got a name here, push button. Oh, push button, that is like music to my ears. It's a very descriptive name because push button is where we physically are going to attach the pin for the push button. That's what when we set up the circuit, we put the push button at pin 2. And look at that, they've initialized push button to 2. So great example of a descriptive variable name. Okay, so first off we note we've declared and initialized all on the same line. So that's pretty much it. That's all we had to do. And there was only one variable here, so that's a pretty easy block of code. And then just note that semicolon finishes up that statement. Okay, well let's move on to the next block of code. The next block of code we come to is the setup function. So inside these curly brackets, there's two functions. There's serial begin, and then there's pin mode. So let's go ahead and talk about serial begin. This is a function that you will learn to love. All right, so let's take a step back. It's kind of a weird looking function, isn't it? There's a period in there, and why is there a period in there? Well, that's because this is actually a function that comes out of a library of functions. And a library is really just a family of functions that work together towards a similar purpose. So if you had like a circus library, it might contain functions like juggle or balance and maybe like flaming circle of death. So to access the functions in the library, all you do is you write the name of the library followed by a period and then the name of the function that you want to get from the library. So with the circus example, we would write circus.juggle, for example. So we would want the juggle function from the circus library. So Arduino has many built-in libraries and many community contributed libraries. So that's people like me and you who we wrote a bunch of functions to solve a certain problem. We wrap them all up in a library, and then we say, hey, this is what we did. Anybody else is welcome to use those functions too. So as you can imagine, that becomes really useful, and you get this huge pool of libraries that you can pull from, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. So you can check the libraries out on the Arduino website, or you can Google for a specific library, and you'd be amazed at what you can find. What really does the serial library do? So what the serial library helps you do is establish communication between your computer and the Arduino board. So if you ever go to marriage counseling, you will know that communication involves sending and receiving. So data can flow both ways. And if you want to establish this communication between your Arduino and your computer, then you have to use the begin function from the serial library. The begin function takes one argument. So that's the number that goes in that parenthesis. Remember, that's called the argument. And the argument here is the baud rate. Okay, so baud rate, that means nothing maybe. I mean, what does that mean, you ask? So it's the rate at which data is going to flow from your computer to your Arduino. And I'm going to give you the short answer right here. Just type in 9600. That's really all you need to know. And I know that seems like I want to know why. I mean, why am I typing 9600? Well, I've put some links on the end of the tutorial, on the written version. So I know you have an insatiable desire to understand all things in the universe, and I totally appreciate that because I'm kind of the same way. But it's just not what we need to talk about here. I just want to move on with the program, but there are links to say why you would type in 9600. But again, basically what we're doing with the serial begin function is we are establishing serial communication between your Arduino and your computer. That's why this line of code is in here. Because what we're going to do is we're going to let the Arduino tell the computer, hey, This is when that button got pressed. And in order to know that, we need to have that serial begin function. All right, so enough about serial begin. Let's move on to our next function, pin mode. Hey, wait, pin mode, we know pin mode. We used it in the last tutorial. So what's cool about pin mode this time around, though, is that now instead of making the push button an output, we're making the push button an input because we want to read voltage on digital pin 2. So again, we send 2 arguments to pin mode. The variable name, push button, which is pin 2, that's where we have our push button attached. And then what is the mode we want? Well, we want it to be an input. And we want it to be an input because we need to read voltage from the digital pin. Okay, so that's all that's going on in the setup block of code.